Go ahead and get started. My name is Risa Hoffman, and I am the director of the David Geffen School of Medicine Global Health Program. And I'm really excited to give some opening remarks. This is our kickoff inaugural joint grand rounds between the Global Health Program and the Center for Social Medicine. And this really arose out of a kinship that we've developed between our two programs, brought together with sort of a common mission and vision around, equity and wanting to think about how we can be vehicles of positive action through medical education, through clinical care and research in the David Geffen School of Medicine, but really across Los Angeles and across our communities, and then, really globally, and how the lessons learned are really both local and global. And we were looking for ways to be challenged and inspired. And out of this was born the Grand Round series. And, we really hope that this becomes something that people enjoy and find intellectually stimulating, and that can bring us together as a community. So I am just really thrilled to see the wonderful attendance. We didn't realize that we had scheduled it on Yom Kippur. We will definitely try to avoid holidays in the future. That was allowed. You'll see him. So send questions to Joel, and he will moderate a discussion at the end for us. And when you send your question, it would be great if you say where you're from, if you're a medical student, your year, if you're from inside or outside of UCLA, just so we can get a sense of the community that we are developing here, which is really exciting. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Liza Buckbinder from the Center for Social Medicine, who's on the move, but is gonna. I think you're muted. Are you able to introduce?
Oh yeah, I was just saying, I apologize. I was trying to find a better Wi-Fi spot. So.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, so it just says, Risa Hoffman said, I am excited that Sam Dubal is our first speaker for this series. And I kind of got to know Dr. Dubal's work with a critique he wrote about Paul Farmer's Partners in Health and some of the contradictions that were being done in the work they were doing on the ground. So I think that this sort of questioning about things that seem as very self-evident truths is really an important work. And I think that it's really exciting to see the work that's being done right now with Dr. Dubal. So just by way of introduction, he is a professor of medical anthropology at the University of Washington in Seattle. He did his medical trainings in terms of medical school at Harvard, and then did an internship in surgery at here in Southern California at UCLA Harbor, and is the author of the book Against Humanity, Lessons from the Lord's Resistance Army, that was published in 2018 with UC Press. And he'll be giving a talk today, Beyond Humanity Towards Justice. So just pass it over to Dr. Sam Dubal.
Thank you so much, Liza. I'm just going to share my screen here. Does that look about right for everyone? Do you see a slideshow? You do. Okay, great. So thanks to everyone for joining me, and it's really wonderful to be back speaking with folks who are concerned with social medicine and global health at UCLA in this really new and important Grand Round series. And I'm very grateful to Liza and the organizing committee for the invitation, as well as to Rachel, Zoe, and Vegeta for coordinating the talk. So I'll start with a brief overview of my talk today. My discussion deals with the ethics of global health and social medicine. Specifically, I want to think carefully about the ways in which we imagine doing good in the world of health. In particular, I'll be critically interrogating ideas and practices of humanity and humanism in medicine. These principles are often called upon to fight against forms of dehumanization that are plaguing both patients and providers. Humanity is also a rallying cry for global health programs and interventions. While in theory, humanity offers a solution to problems of injustice and inequity, in practice, it can often be a problem in itself. And so I want to try to convince you today that working for humanity is not the same as working for justice, and that we should move beyond humanity and towards other ethical models and practices to better steer towards the kind of justice we strive for in our work. So I'd like to open with a personal story that Liza actually alluded to of my own kind of struggles with the limits and blind spots of biomedicine and global health. And I'm hopeful that, amongst a similar group of people with interests in global health and social medicine, that this approach can help identify problems that perhaps others share and can open a space to think about them differently. So the story begins with the bombing of a nonprofit medical clinic in Peru, which is something I learned about as a first-year medical student. This was 12 years ago at Harvard. I started medical school with a strong interest in global health and social medicine, and was determined to become a doctor providing care to the global poor. And I was particularly excited about the possibility of working with physician anthropologists Paul Farmer and Jim Kim and their organization Partners in Health, or PIH, as many of you know, which had arisen as one of the most innovative programs providing preferential healthcare treatment for the poor across the world. But on learning more about the organization during a first-year class on social medicine, I came across a troubling bit of history that the Maoist rebel group, the Sendero Luminoso, or Shining Path in English, had targeted and bombed a PIH clinic in Peru. This slide is just an illustrative sample of Sendero Luminoso propaganda. And I couldn't really quite believe how the rebels could find PIH objectionable, knowing that Paul Farmer was a socially conscious, critical medical anthropologist who was influenced by liberation theology and Marxist theory. But on further analysis, it seemed that the PIH clinic had been inserted into a kind of counter-revolutionary policy that was being formulated by the government of then Peruvian President Fujimori to reduce civilian support for the insurgency. And so PIH, in many ways, became reformers and not revolutionaries, as Paul Farmer himself reflected. I'm quoting here from one of his texts. Sendero's analysis of PIH as reformers in the pejorative sense was less easy to dismiss. We were patching up wounds. Such interventions would not, it's true, alter the overall trends of poverty registered in the slums of Lima, settlements growing at a rapid rate. With a certain degree of angst, we continued our modest attempts, end quote. But they weren't just kind of delaying the radical transformation of society through this piecemeal healthcare provision. They were actually concretely aligning themselves with the government against the Sendero Luminoso, that at least in Farmer's reading, genuinely sought radical equality for the poorest indigenous groups in Peru. And I know many of you with greater knowledge will undoubtedly know that this story of the Sendero Luminoso is much more complex and contentious, but I want to stay focused on how Farmer was reading the rebel group. So in many ways, PIH kind of unwittingly became counter-revolutionaries, ignoring politics and history as so many humanitarian interventions before then had. This is a picture of Jim Kim, who is, of course, one of the co-founders of PIH and former president of the World Bank, standing with Ollanta Humala, who is former president of Peru, and who as a military officer served in the counterinsurgency campaign against the Sendero Luminoso. So philosopher Slavoj Žižek describes the violence of Sendero Luminoso on taking over the villages as follows. I'm quoting here. They did not focus on killing the soldiers or the policemen stationed there, but more on the UN or US agricultural consultants or health workers, trying to help the local peasants. Brutal as this procedure was, it was sustained by the correct insight. They, not the police or the army, were the true danger, the enemy at its most perfidious, since they were, quote unquote, lying in the guise of truth. The more they were innocent, the more they really tried to help the peasants, the more they served as a tool of the United States. It is only such a strike against the enemy at his best, at the point where the enemy indeed helps us, that displays a true revolutionary autonomy and sovereignty. If one adopts the attitude of, let us take from the enemy what is good and reject or even fight against what is bad, one is already caught in the liberal trap of humanitarian help, end quote. So PIH's problem is, even if disappointing for an organization that's ostensibly aligned with social justice values, one that's quite common to most liberal medical humanitarian action. Anthropologists critical of humanitarianism have long questioned its often contradictory principles and practice, the way in which it claims to be neutral and apolitical, but kind of exists firmly within the realm of politics, and is therefore often subject to gross manipulations such as militarized humanitarianism and other unjust wars that are undertaken in the name of humanity. And another aspect of it is particularly in its highly funded forms, especially as philanthrocapitalism from the likes of Bill Gates. A lot of the medical humanitarian work tries to sweep up the very poverty and suffering that it created, advocating for social reform without actually changing the system that created the poverty in the first place. And so ignoring the real roots of suffering and claiming to operate outside politics, humanitarian interventions, including I think most global health work, tend toward being ahistorical, technical, and piecemeal in ways that maintain rather than challenge deep-seated structures of violence. So as someone who was really dedicated to treating the cause rather than the symptom of social disease, I personally grew quite quickly disillusioned with all kinds of liberal medical humanitarian action, including that of PIHs, and turned to anthropology to try to figure out how to do good in the world in ways that promoted rather than hindered wide-scale systemic change. And so, as I was going through my own training and I continued to kind of work toward these questions of justice, I think to myself, how can we align our goodwill as healers with a politics of justice rather than a politics of compassion, avoiding this humanitarian trap of claiming neutrality or impartiality? And how could we reverse the trend that's been in place roughly since the late 1960s of taking care of victims in the name of human rights or psychiatric harm, and returning to the practice of joining freedom fighters in their liberation struggles in the political name of revolution? So in other words, how could we construct a revolutionary rather than a reformist or a humanitarian medicine from our desires to help the poor and marginalized? So what I've come to understand, and what I'll argue today, is that holding on to the liberal concept of humanity prevents us from addressing deeper questions of justice in global health specifically, and clinical medicine more broadly. As the philosophical underpinning of global health and much of biomedicine, humanity, together with its cousin humanism, stands today as one of the main ethical forces maintaining rather than challenging the systemic ways in which injustice and inequity are continually produced and reproduced. In order to move closer to real forms of change and justice, we need to look past humanity to other ethical issues, other ethical bases for the common good. Humanity and justice are not synonyms, and working for humanity does not necessarily mean working for justice. Much of the argument that I'm going to present today comes out of ethnographic work I've done with former rebels of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. I don't want to go too deeply into the specifics of my research today, which is really another talk in itself. And I'm happy to discuss some of this in the Q&A if there's time. But very briefly, in this book that Liza mentioned, I examined the ways in which rebels who were fighting this war in Uganda were characterized as inhuman by others, looking at the kinds of transgressions of the boundaries of humanity they were seen to have performed. And while most scholars were concerned with whether or how the rebels committed crimes against humanity, I was much more concerned with how humanity comes to monopolize what we in the West think of as sacred and unchallengeable. And so what I've learned from this work is that the concept of humanity is by no means equivalent to justice, nor does it serve, even as it usually purports, a common good. And I argue that while it's often seen as a solution to various kinds of social ills, humanity is actually a problem in itself. So to understand this argument, and in particular its relevance to clinical medicine and global health, let's look more carefully at how humanity and humanism are used today in our clinics and hospitals in the US. So for a lot of people, it's precisely the lack of humanity, the lack of humanism, that's the diagnosis of the sickness of contemporary clinical medicine. Most clinicians spend more time looking at their computer screens than talking with their patients on a day-to-day basis. Patients are shuffled in and out of exam rooms and operating rooms, cases of diseases like pneumonias and hernias that come and go, rather than being seen or treated as human beings with stories, emotions, and narratives. The increasingly technological character of American biomedical practice, including electronic medical records, has also led to discontent among patients and doctors alike, that patients are treated like robots instead of human beings. And the corporate structuring of healthcare delivery has led many practitioners to feel unable to care for patients in the way that they want. This is, of course, increasingly being acknowledged by healthcare corporations who compete for patient consumers by advertising that they do things differently, that they treat their patients as human beings, which seems to be the exception rather than the norm. In fact, the entire field of medical humanities, within medical education at least, grew as a counterbalance to a lot of these trends, which have led to a decline in the empathy of clinicians and the loss of a so-called human touch. Narrative medicine in particular, which is the attempt to kind of transform technical disease cases into lived human experiences, is in part driven by a desire to humanize the patient and their experience of disease. And at the other end of the patient-provider relationship, humanity and humanism are increasingly being called upon to rehumanize clinicians as well. High levels of provider burnout, in which healers are said to suffer from depersonalization, among other forms of alienating distress, are said to have led providers to treat patients as objects rather than human beings. At present, attempts to counter burnout call on increased training in mindfulness, stress management, and other forms of so-called wellness to restore the humanity of healers broken by a failing system, instead of trying to revolutionize the violent infrastructure of the US healthcare system itself. I'll share a brief personal example. I remember as a surgical intern receiving a frantic call on the morning of a required residency wellness retreat. And it was a call from my senior resident who was castigating me for not being on time to the event. And I, of course, was still at the hospital covering patients on 2 services and had to reassure the resident that I would attend to my mandated wellness as soon as I finished my work. So, given the situations with patients, with providers, many people say that what we need for both clinicians and patients is more caring attention to people in their suffering. In other words, we need more humanism and not less. And so in concepts like humanism in medicine, they find a form of opposition to the kinds of approaches that treat patients as disease cases that are processed through clinical algorithms and technologies. And humanism in medicine is really a moral response to a lot of these problems. As many of you know, humanistic medicine has been characterized as an approach that's sensitive to patients' cultural backgrounds, to their values and their preferences. It's often seen to be opposed to the pressures of finance, of academia, of productivity, of documentation, among other problems within American medicine. Many of you are probably familiar with the Gold Foundation, which is a prominent organization involved in medical education that advocates for this kind of medicine that, as they put it, helps keep healthcare human. The foundation provides grants to medical, nursing, and physician assistant schools to host the rites of passage that are white coat ceremonies. I'm sure this is the time of year for new incoming students to undergo these rituals. These ceremonies are meant, as the foundation says, to, quote, welcome students to healthcare practice and elevate the value of humanism as the core of healthcare. The foundation also sponsors a Humanism in Medicine Award for caring, compassionate medical school faculty, physicians, with, quote, the desirable personal qualities necessary to the practice of patient-centered medicine. And included in the kind of selection criteria, as again, some of you probably know and have been involved in committees or nominating people for the award, or things like bedside manner, how you respect patients, the sense of altruism and sensitivity that you show towards patients. So in his 2018 Humanism in Medicine Thought Leader Lecture at the AAMC annual meeting, Dr. George Thibault warned against the threat of dehumanization. He argued, and I quote, "It's not just medicine that's being threatened by being dehumanized. Our society at large is turning against the principles of humanism that have been its underpinning since its founding. Political events in the United States and abroad threaten the principles of humanism and of democratic liberalism, which has been the predominant form of government in the Western world, regardless of which political party is in power. The election of Donald Trump was both a symptom of and accelerant to this anti-humanism trend in the United States," end quote. You know, I certainly support the humanist qualities that are advocated by the Gold Foundation and others in theory, but I'm unconvinced that a humanist medicine is sufficient to get to the heart of the problems of biomedicine. A humanist medicine treats the symptoms of a social disease without treating the underlying disease or the underlying cause. The focus on humanism obfuscates the more radical and widespread origins of disease in both language and action. In other words, the root causes of the absence of care. When humanism becomes the moral mediator of the kinds of changes we want to see in the practice of biomedicine, we're left with a specific prescription for change that's aimed at the care of the individual patient or healer that often disengages from other ways of caring that are aimed at the societal patient. The figure of the human comes to dominate progressive action, undermining the possibility for more radical forms of collective political medicine. Specifically, turns toward humanizing medicine do little to call into question clinical medicine's way of creating and reproducing unequal power relations. These humanizing turns do not bring into question systematic political, economic, and racial underpinnings of the US healthcare system. They don't fundamentally change the relationship of the bourgeois clinician to the marginalized sick, nor do they challenge fundamental white Western ideals of what it means to be human, including the presumed duality of mind and body. As physician and bioethicist Jeffrey Bishop puts it, humanism is the add-on that makes the power more palatable. At the same time, as I'll come back to later, it's simply not true that humanism has been, as Dr. Thibault claims, the predominant form of government in the Western world. As Indigenous and Black Americans have pointed out for hundreds of years, this kind of humanism has usually only meant that white people were human, with non-white peoples belonging to a separate category of beings. Let me shift gears slightly from clinical medicine and to global health to examine the roles that humanism and humanity play in global health. Outside of the American hospital or clinic, humanism and humanity are also central philosophies and rallying cries in global health. I should say that by global health, I'm referring to a specific enterprise consisting of governments, NGOs, multinational organizations like the WHO, universities like my own, the University of Washington, as well as UCLA, private philanthropists like Bill Gates, and pharmaceutical and biotech companies that are working to improve the health of poor people across the world. As a field of humanitarian biomedicine, this industry is grounded in the idea of a common humanity and usually operates through technical vertical interventions that don't get involved in what we might traditionally think of as politics. Affectively, this industry operates through the idea that everyone is human and that poor people across the world deserve and have the right to the same healthcare as rich Europeans and Americans. Global health as an academic discipline has blossomed in American universities, in part because of the idealism of students who want to make a difference in the lives of others, who are moved to action by reports of injustice and suffering from Tijuana to Uganda. And I was certainly one of these students. The energy and resistance against injustice is important, necessary, and hopeful. But the problem at present is that global health is designed to harness and translate that energy into apolitical, technical interventions that don't challenge the fundamental forces driving global inequality and poverty, including global white supremacy, capitalism, and imperialism. Humanity and humanism serve as the safe flag under which these ships sail, what's known in merchant shipping as the flag of convenience. So in this industry, ships may choose to register in and fly under flags of countries where laws and regulations, or the lack thereof, make it more convenient for them to operate. Perhaps safety and labor regulations are more lax. Perhaps their taxes and other fees are minimal, and prosecution of violations might be rare in these particular jurisdictions. And so what I'm trying to argue and propose is that humanity and humanism are the flags under which medicine and global health operate. They're safe in the sense that it's very difficult to object to an intervention that's being done in the name of humanity or with humanitarian sentiment. And they're often convenient because they don't require more careful inspection and vetting of the kinds of projects or actions being carried out. And so by flying under these safe names, projects can often operate, even unintentionally and with total goodwill, in ways that actually create very different effects from those that they sought. I think it's worth reflecting on the origins of global health and the industry it spawned today to understand how and why it is that humanity is this safe flag for global health interventions. Some of you are probably familiar with Randall Packard's work. As he discusses, global health has its roots essentially in technical or development assistance, which itself arose out of colonial medicine. And so this practice very broadly assumed that dark native bodies in colonial possessions were diseased and pathological, and interventions were often done to sanitize countries and peoples in conjunction with colonial desires to Christianize and uplift what they saw as brutes or savages, lower forms of being on the hierarchy of humanity. And these interventions were, as I think we see in the legacy in many of them today, or they're the progeny of these interventions, in the sense that they're top-down, they're technical, vertical interventions on specific health conditions or diseases that ignored the need to develop health infrastructure, as well as the need to address underlying causes of disease. And of course, they often proceeded as though they were oblivious to the very political and racial conditions of colonialism under which their operations were made possible. But with some time, we've been able to see the idea of the goodwill that they had and the attempt to ameliorate suffering that was embodied in the concept of humanity was able to deflect the deeper scrutiny that we are able to see today from a distance, I think, in a lot of the colonial interventions. So understanding these kinds of origins, I want to think critically as well about global health today. As Joanna Crane argues, the rapid growth of the global health industry within American universities is generating a 21st century academic scramble for Africa, with universities rushing to find so-called partnerships across the continent to give students and faculty opportunities to work in what's often glossed over as a resource-poor setting. Despite being called partnerships, these arrangements usually marginalize the needs and voices of those in the Global South, despite the best intentions of those involved. As a colleague from the Global South working in this American industry noted bluntly to me recently, it's a colonial enterprise. Many clinicians or students traveling to do global health know or understand little about the politics, history, and cultures of the interventions that they're participating in. A fact that can be particularly embarrassing in places like El Salvador or Guatemala, where the US government has directly contributed through military and foreign policy to the kinds of inequality that they try to fix. The people that they assist are often reduced to poor dark swaths of apolitical humanity in need. As Adia Benton points out, rarely if ever are questions of race, uncomfortable yet ever present, brought out openly, even as they structure the distinctions made between victim and savior, beneficiary and provider. Or to be more specific, rarely are these questions raised by the mostly white clinicians arriving from the global north, as they're certainly subjects of conversation amongst workers in the global south within these organizations, for whom whiteness is closely linked to economic domination, colonialism, and global white supremacy. So these discomforts of contemporary global health are not accidental, of course, but follow from an important, if unnerving, historical trajectory. And when NGOs like Doctors Without Borders came to prominence in the early 1970s, there was perhaps at that time more of a split camp of people in the global health world, as it were, at that time, that were seeking to do good in the world. And there were those that favored the kind of short-term actions geared toward an impartial alleviation of individual human suffering. And this group eventually has won out and has come to dominate global health. But there were also the so-called third worldists, people who supported long-term projects that sought to overturn international orders and powers that reproduced colonial domination. And these people haven't gone away, of course, but the hegemonic philosophy of global health doesn't usually embrace their radicality, their desire to get to the roots of the problem of global disease and illness. Instead, today's predominant global health philosophy is well embodied by this campaign ad for Doctors Without Borders in South Africa. They proclaim here that they don't care about why, who, or where, that they only want to save lives. So on the one hand, claiming impartiality and neutrality can be strategically useful to support populations under siege by repressive and unjust regimes, to avoid the kinds of attacks on hospitals that MSF has suffered in Syria or Eastern Ukraine. And it can create space for short-term solutions. But when it comes to dominate the philosophy of an entire discipline, its aversion to politics, to race, history, colonialism, and other structural relations of power becomes an excuse to reproduce injustice and inequity. I'm clearly skipping over a lot of nuances here, including the vision for Alma Ata and plans for primary healthcare across the globe, as well as the work of a lot of agencies and groups that are trying to contribute now, in particular to constructing public health infrastructure, including, in fact, Paul Farmer's own University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda. And I should also note that the kind of broader dynamics of global health are slowly changing in other ways, not least of which is because of a more diverse group of trainees, many of whom come from the places where so-called global health is being performed. But I think by and large, the field's focus on humanity and saving lives at the expense of enacting real political change lets the agents of structural violence off the hook. So in both clinical medicine and global health, humanity serves to gloss over real political problems and histories at hand by appealing to a politics of life. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong. I'm not opposed to the principles and dreams that are engendered by the idea of humanity and visions of helping others. But I worry that when those displace real conversations about justice, history, politics, and race, that humanity becomes, as it's been for Black Americans since at least the beginning of slavery, a kind of a farce, an illusory force that claims to do good while surreptitiously going down a reformist road that doesn't fundamentally challenge relations of power. And it's this use of humanity in relationship to its close cousins, humanism and humane, that continues to pose problems in the struggle toward health justice. Many of you probably know that these debates over humanity and humanism aren't exclusive to the discipline of medicine. They've been raised time and again elsewhere, primarily by Black radical scholars and revolutionaries, scholars of color and their allies, as part of a broader critique of the violence of liberalism. And so in a largely white academic field, liberal humanism proclaims the equality of individual selves with rights, with liberty, with freedom, an inequality that doesn't actually exist but has been perpetually postponed. And so for people of color, for colonized subjects, formerly colonized subjects, humanity has always been a mirage, a false promise, a dishonest ideology. As a kind of abstract universality, humanity has in practice violently made men of Europeans and slaves and savages of others. The exclusionary perversions of European humanism refused, and I would argue continue to refuse, the recognition of a Black humanity or the humanity of other subjugated peoples. Part of the problem here, as the cultural theorist Sylvia Wynter argues, is that the supposedly universal concept of humanity is usually taken to mean the same thing as Western bourgeois man. So this particular code that's exclusive of the experiences and dreams of non-white peoples. And part of her argument and others is that, well, this is a partial humanism, not a full humanism. And so to speak about this kind of humanity as a universality is violent insofar as it precludes alternative visions of humanity, these kind of new kinds of radical humanisms that decolonize what it means to be human. Given kind of what's been going on within our country in terms of race and politics over the past year, I may not need to hammer this home, but I should, have us remember that the preamble to the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights. Yet, of course, the settler colonialist authors were white supremacists who owned slaves that they clearly didn't recognize as men, and also made the killing of Native peoples part of American identity. So my point here is not to just rehash this obvious, if painful truth about American history, but to show that this isn't an exception. As Charles Mills shows in his powerful book, The Racial Contract, the utopian idea of humanity excluded Black and Native people in this country from the very beginning. He notes it would be a fundamental error to see racism as anomalous, as a mysterious deviation from European Enlightenment humanism. Rather, it needs to be realized that European humanism usually meant that only Europeans were human. So in other words, excluding others from humanity isn't the exception, but the rule for a nation that has been born in genocide. Let me point to kind of a specific ongoing controversy that should help make this abstract idea a little bit more concrete. So consider the Black Lives Matter movement for racial justice. Predictably, it's been met with a lot of resistance across the nation, particularly in white conservative communities. But rather than proclaim and protest that Black lives don't matter, many opponents have taken up the slogan, all lives matter. And I think it's probably common sense to most of us today that this proclamation is patently racist, but it's also a profoundly humanist statement, and one that ignores politics, history, and ongoing processes of injustice. And it's this valence of humanity that I argue holds the same danger for global health and clinical medicine. Of course, I'm not saying that the humanist practitioners of global health and clinical medicine are intentionally racist or actively promoting injustice, but here the danger of humanism lies precisely in its masquerade. And it's a mask that's much more difficult to unveil in medicine, I think, than it is in conservative America. Humanism offers universal fulfillment in a supposedly common state of freedom while ignoring the problematic terms and conditions on which that fulfillment is built. And in doing so, it reproduces inequity and injustice under the guise of good intentions. So speaking critically with you all, a group of like-minded folks, I think, about humanism and humanity, I don't mean to alienate or to accuse, especially not those who might be actively involved in running the kinds of global health or clinical medicine programs that I've described and critiqued. My goal really is to try to challenge some of our cherished conventions to move toward a new plane of theory and practice in global health and clinical medicine, that without dismissing the importance of the symptomatic treatment of the things like bedside manner and care and sensitivity, invest more of our therapeutic efforts towards the root causes. So in the time we have remaining, I just want to provide some optimism and possibilities for hope, some vision for new kinds of global health and social justice that I hope move from a humanist politics of compassion toward a liberatory politics of justice. And I recognize that making large-scale change through piecemeal global health work can seem futile, sometimes counter-revolutionary at worst. And that's not to say that it shouldn't continue or it can't continue, albeit in different forms. And so what I found useful and I think is instructive to share today is some lessons from the prison abolitionist world, to think carefully about what kinds of actions promote reform or window dressing, and then what kinds of actions promote real transformative change. So abolitionist scholars and activists who've drawn on conceptual work by the philosopher Andre Gortz distinguish between reformist reform and non-reformist reform as they think about how to enact social justice. So prison abolitionists and those who call for the defunding of the police seek in the long term to close prisons to reduce the scale of policing. But they also recognize that this is a really long and difficult process and that it doesn't happen just overnight. And so in the short term, they recognize that there are tiny steps that are made in this struggle that can either expand the reach of policing and prisons or work that can chip away at that kind of power. And they carefully analyze policy reforms by asking themselves, is this change or action that's proposed reformist, or is it non-reformist? So critical resistance policies provide a very useful example. So for this group, which seeks to end the prison industrial complex, increasing training to produce so-called better cops is a reformist reform. It expands funding to the police. It reinforces the idea that police are needed to increase safety, if only they were just better at their jobs. And it increases the scope of policing to include responding to things like mental health crises, which abolitionists argue should not be the purview of the police. By contrast, withholding pensions and refusing to rehire cops found to use excessive force is a kind of non-reformist reform. It reduces community funding, supporting policing harms, challenges the idea that killings and excessive force are exceptions rather than the rule, and it reduces the ability of police to reassign or otherwise maintain employment of officers known for their use of violence. And in LA, as many of you know, work guided by the principle of non-reformist reform stopped the construction of a new LA County jail. Spearheaded by Justice LA, among other groups, the campaign opposed the reformist reform that was on the table, which was this plan to build this new and better jail that would replace the aging, cramped jail. And so rather than spending money to build essentially what was a better or more humane cage, which is a project that just increases the scale of policing and criminalization, they want money to be redirected to be spent on community violence prevention, on youth development programs, supporting housing, mental health, and other community-based decarcerating systems and practices of care. So put simply, just instead of spending money to treat the symptom, which was at the time a high population of people in jails, by just increasing the jail capacity or size, they wanted money to treat the fundamental root causes and thereby reduce the number of people who were incarcerated in the first place. And so this framework of distinguishing reformist from non-reformist reforms is one that I think that's long overdue for integration in practices of global health and social medicine. As I've demonstrated, I hope humanism and humanity are conceptually reformist reforms. They hold tight to the racial contract, insisting that we only need to make more inclusive forms of liberal democracy that recognize Black and Indigenous peoples as also human. And clinically, efforts to increase humanism and humanity have often channeled money into window dressing initiatives like yoga classes and other wellness events for burned out residents, rather than addressing the political economic ways that corporate healthcare exploits physician labor and goodwill for profit, turning compassionate healers into single cogs. And these efforts they don't really undo the pathological processes of racism, capitalism, and techno-utopianism, among other ongoing mechanisms of health injustice. But rather they provide a kind of band-aid for a rotting abscess that actually really needs an incision and drainage. And in global health as well, humanist approaches that offer healthcare for poor people of color rarely work to change the entrenched structures of power that create the apparent need for the discipline of global health in the first place. And so, you know, a global health intervention that focuses on, let's say, reducing HIV transmission in Uganda doesn't typically work to undermine structural inequalities in politics that maintain or make transmission possible in the first place. And more often than not, a lot of these interventions call for more technical interventions or things like behavioral changes, individual changes to create a health difference. And so quite often the premise of the interventions as well serves to help the humanitarians more than those who I argue are humanitarianized, who are transformed into objects of humanitarian action. By things like, you know, getting financial capital, like grants, symbolic capital, like published papers, and so forth. And so humanism, I think, can bring some comfort to the sick, but it won't bring justice. And just alone, it continues a tradition of change that's more clinical rather than critical, and that's more concerned with individual sickness rather than structural or social sicknesses. So what I guess then is the possibility for non-reformist reform in clinical medicine and global health today. I think there are certainly historical precedents to take heart from that originate from spaces other than colonial and global health industrial histories. So rather than acting in the neutral name of humanity and kind of ignoring the political, many of them put medicine at the service of broader social and political movements. So Alondra Nelson's study of the Black Panthers, for example, shows how the party's medical work on disease and healing was coextensive with a broader politics. In other words, they formulated a sense of health that was politics by other means. Activists, you know, who were caring for poor Black patients weren't there because they wanted to help their unfortunate fellow humans. It was more that their visions for change extended to explicitly political and structural transformations of a racist world. And so social justice and health weren't these inseparable, were inseparable in these visions. This idea resonates as well with the Zapatista notion of authentic health, which is a state of being not limited to biology, but inclusive of housing, work, justice, land, food, and education. And so to be involved in this kind of global health, as Anne Emanuel Byrne and Theodore Brown argue, is not to be a global health volunteer or a global health professional, but to be a health internationalist, a comrade in health, recognizing the inseparability of health and politics. And I think these kinds of visions continue today in what are comparatively lesser known global health groups. So perhaps not, you know, the Gates Foundation or Partners in Health, but groups like Doctors for Global Health, the People's Health Movement, among others. And for a lot of these folks, you know, the role models aren't Paul Farmer, but Che Guevara, the Argentine physician revolutionary, as well as Norm Bethune, who's a communist Canadian surgeon who valued justice over charity. And both Che and Bethune served on the front lines of guerrilla warfares against unjust dictatorships. Bethune actually introduced some of the first mobile blood transfusions, not as an apolitical kind of technical biomedical intervention, but as a strategic service for wounded soldiers who were fighting against the fascist dictatorship of General Franco on the front lines of the Spanish Civil War. And in one of the last manuscripts he wrote before he died, which was entitled Wounds, Bethune wrote about who he considered to be his enemies. And I'll quote here. "They are the respectable ones. They are honored. They call themselves and are called gentlemen. They are the pillars of the state, of the church, of society. They support private and public charity out of the excess of their wealth, but threaten a reduction on the profit of their money and they become ruthless. There can be no permanent peace in the world while they live. Such an organization of human society as permits them to exist must be abolished. These men make the wounds. So I think we're living in a very difficult time, but one that is also ripe with political movement for racial and other forms of social justice, and offering our technical services and skills in ways that support these movements is one kind of non-reformist reform. So I'll ask, what if instead of flying under the flag of humanism or humanity, we flew under the flag of solidarity or justice? Could we do the same kinds of work, but for movements and organizations like Black Lives Matter or for Justice LA? In hospitals and clinics across the US, could we try to fix a broken system by designing programs that counter the structures that keep it broken, rather than window dressing those structures through humanist claims to care and compassion? Instead of mandated wellness retreats that treat burnout as a flaw of unprepared clinicians, perhaps we could have serious discussions about funding and social priorities that take into account the ways that physician compassion is often exploited for corporate gain. Instead of training clinicians to be empathetic, or rather kind of training them to stop losing empathy under the conditions of their work, perhaps we could change the realities of practice that result in rushed 10-minute appointments that are spent primarily documenting in EMRs. Rather than operating under the mantra that all of our patients' lives matter, perhaps we could move toward more equitable care by recognizing the extra burdens carried by marginalized patients whose lives and histories tell us don't actually matter to society. And this seems kind of like a jarring idea in some sense, but it's also one that I think clinicians practice implicitly in choosing where and how to work, what kinds of specialist training to undertake. I'm sure that many of you, like myself, kind of don't really think twice about applying your medical skills in a public institution, serving marginalized people of color rather than a private concierge or cosmetic clinic in Beverly Hills. And so I think there are, of course, many good examples of this kind of non-reformist reform, including ongoing programs here at UCLA. So the movement, for example, towards structural competency in clinical medicine that Philippe Bourgois, Helena Hansen, and others have been involved in, attempts to expand the purview of medicine beyond the technical by asking patients directly about their needs in housing, financial security, and other seemingly extra clinical structural problems. And these kinds of shifts can help lead to new forms of intervention, things like prescriptions for food or other kinds of subsidies, as well as alliances between doctors and activists, lawyers, and others who are working for structural transformation. I think a similar philosophy can and should be used to evaluate programs and interventions in global health. That's to say, we should ask ourselves, is this intervention or policy going to reinforce existing systems or structures that produce injustice, or will it work to chip away at it? And following or inspecting the money is always a useful exercise in this kind of analysis. So let's say that you have funding for a particular project that's been secured via a generous Gates Foundation grant. It's worth asking whether that money will be used toward dismantling world structures that make it possible for one person to own more wealth than 122 countries combined. Or will that money simply reinforce those systems that justify such an enormous private accumulation of wealth on the basis that generous, benevolent philanthropists will trickle it down? So will the money be used to kind of lend support to the idea that the spread of market capitalism is a cure for inequality? Will it offer philanthropists a way that's quite easy, controlled, and non-threatening to reduce tax burdens? I think these are some of the kind of more critical questions that we could be asking. It's telling, I think, to reflect just even on the etymology of the word philanthropy. So philanthropy is from the Latin, and it indicates a love, a philia or phil of humanity, or anthropos, mankind. And it's no surprise, I think, given the kinds of critiques of humanism that I've presented, that a lot of health activists and health internationalists aren't calling for more philanthropy, because it seems clear that loving humanity doesn't necessarily mean loving justice. At the same time, I think we could be and should be open to the idea that money acquired through unjust means could be repurposed toward more just ends. And the real question is how to align that love of humanity with a love for justice. And I think what's very crucial is to maintain a certain kind of self-discernment, one that's attentive to self-criticism and that also privileges the agency, ideas, voices, and needs of marginalized folks who are suffering from injustice. So in closing, let me just emphasize how important it is to think critically about the ways in which humanity and humanism are used in clinical medicine and global health. I really feel like it's all too easy to simply go along with or approve, a seemingly innocent or benevolent approach or philosophy like humanism. But as I've shown, I think it's worth being suspicious of humanist claims in health, especially when they draw attention away from politics and toward the abstraction of saving lives, or when they privilege, changing or shaping individuals and their behaviors over structural change. Adopting this abolitionist perspective of favoring non-reformist reform over reformist reform, I think it's useful to ask skeptically of different programs and policies, will this, what we plan to do or this thing that we're implementing, will it entrench existing structures of power or will it help to dismantle them? And the answer, of course, is not always easy or obvious to reach, but that critical reflection and thought, I think, will help better position our work toward the direction of justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I hope I'm being heard. But I thought it really was a wonderfully thoughtful critique of humanism and the ways in which kind of ideology is infused in our, kind of fundamental thoughts about what we do as physicians, and it does really help encourage us to think critically about, how we use various kind of words that are really much more value laden than we would imagine, that are often, that help reinforce often or can potentially reinforce, the various circumstances that we're trying to alleviate as physicians. And I think what's really also great is that you've, kind of underlined why having social medicine and global health together doing grand rounds is really a great thing, because these are questions that are both local as well as global, which is what motivated when Reese and I first started talking about this. We thought that of course we should be doing a grand rounds together because we are dealing with the same sort of issues. So again, thanks so much. And I want, so we don't have a huge amount of time. So I think, the question, and this is sort of summarizing some of the questions that is, let's see. So we have a question from Kevin Blair, who is a junior faculty member. And he is asking, in our current polarized climate, how can we work to achieve justice and ideals that you've laid out? And I guess also I was thinking, how do we achieve that? I mean, I'm thinking, kind of extending that is, how do we do that in our everyday clinical practice as well? I mean, how does this translate? Especially, I mean, I realize a lot of medical students are really much more wanting to be socially engaged in their practice of medicine, and do see themselves as wanting to make substantive and kind of more radical changes in how we deliver healthcare. And so how does that kind of, how can they do that without feeling overwhelmed, I guess? And I do think kind of it addresses the seeking justice in such a polarized climate that we're living in as well.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks to Kevin for the questions and everyone. So how to achieve justice? A simple question to start off with. A couple of things came to mind. So one is, in maybe a less than satisfactory answer, but I think what's very clear in contemporary biomedicine today is that we simply don't have the language to be able to address a lot of the social questions that arise, because those problems and questions are inevitably kind of reformulated into or rethought of as biological questions divorced from social questions. And so, the work in structural competency is trying to kind of bring these together. And I think that there's at least promise there in trying to figure out a language that will give us a vocabulary to be able to deal with problems that are not medical and that are social in the clinic. And so being able to give a name to that, to have, I'm not sure if Philippe is on the call, but he and others have developed, it looks like he is, kind of tools for being able to create questionnaires for patients that ask about structural conditions, that think about other facets of care outside of the immediate pathological biological agent. And I think more than anything else, like being able to open up that space is what's so valuable, just because, in the day-to-day practice, as you said, Joel, and as many of us experience, it's so difficult in that clinical setting when you're being kind of constrained by all kinds of different paradigms and practices that you don't really have control over. They're very social, and they've been taught for generations, obviously, and constitute even ideas of what we think constitutes disease and health, is at least one step to try and change that.
Great. We're at 6:02, and and there are a lot of great, I think we have time for one more question, just so that we don't go too late. Even though there are a whole bunch of questions, hopefully they can be able to email you or something.
That'd be great. Yeah, let me put it back on my email. I'll share my screen and put my email back up.
And oops, I'm losing my chat here. Sorry.
Sorry, I may have done that.
Oh, not your fault. Okay, so here's another question from. I'm going to mess up the pronunciation of Hamang Acharya, but he asked, what strategies do you recommend to recruit establishment medical institutions to fund community-based and research international health programs? Many of these programs will not lead to financial or social capital for these groups, but have a health equity benefit.
It's a great policy question. It's not a world that I'm necessarily involved in part, as you can probably tell by the kind of narrative of my story, because of one where it became kind of difficult to exist in those kinds of worlds. Again, what I'm trying to move toward and trying to bring back in the idea of non-reformist reform and thinking carefully through different decisions and how one might, at the same time find coincidences between motives that are justice motivated and those that align with that of a particular corporation or funding agency and so forth. I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer that. I'm sure a lot of folks who have more policy experience are. It's certainly a very difficult question. And then again, as someone who kind of, through my own personal trajectory, has kind of moved outside of that system of policy, is one that I don't really have a lot of confidence in that actually happening.
What's very cool about your talk is it raises a huge number of questions that I think are really important for us to think about as clinicians and as, either in global health or more locally. And so I want to thank you again for our talk, for the talk. And we have another grand rounds coming up, and I was supposed to have got, and let me see if I can.
Yeah, I got it, Joel. So it's going to be October 22nd at 8 a.m. It's Dr. Sarah Hawkes from the University College London, who's going to be talking about sex, gender, and COVID-19. So we will send out announcements about that one. And really, thank you so much to Dr. Dubal, and thanks to everyone who joined. And please do follow up with Dr. Dubal with your questions. I have a feeling he'd love to continue the conversation. And I hope we can all find ways to continue to discuss this amongst ourselves. So many really interesting, important questions and challenges for our community. So to be continued. And thanks to everyone, and thanks to the Global Health team for setting up the logistics for the talk. Yeah. Everyone have a good night.
Thank you all. Please do send an email. I'd be happy to continue the chat afterward.
Great.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.